Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kies. I want to thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. Now, if you happen to be listening right now, right this minute, it is actually Wednesday, August 3rd, 2022. It's about 5:15 in the afternoon Eastern time. And as my manner is sometimes, not always, I am actually broadcasting this live on my Facebook page and then also on the Truth Be Told Radio Network Facebook page. So if you happen to be watching right now, great. Thank you. Welcome. Glad to have you here. Glad you're tuning in. But for my regular listeners, Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. And of course, there are a wide variety of ways that you can catch my show. You can go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website, which is simply www.truthbetoldnetwork.org, and click on the big listen button. And you can use a variety of apps to listen to the show on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, your Android app, my Tuner app, TuneIn Radio, Wi-Fi Radio, bunch of different applications that you can use to listen to the show. And of course, we are also available on most significant podcast platforms. So Audible, Anchor, Amazon, and a bunch of others. You will find my show as well as other shows from the Truth Be Told Radio Network available in podcast form. So I really want to thank you for joining me. Excited about today's show. Going to delve into some new information. I'm also going to try something a little bit new as far as format is concerned. And we're just going to have some fun today. So let's dive right into this. Let's actually cover another small bit of business before we dive right into it. You know how this works. This is social media. So if you appreciate content like this, if you would please like, follow, and subscribe to my Facebook page, certainly my website, and of course my YouTube page, that would really be awesome, as well as the Truth Be Told Radio Network Facebook page, website, and their YouTube channel. That helps us get more content out to you. And the Truth Be Told Radio Network is sponsored by Gaius Carbon 60. Now, this is a dietary supplement designed to balance pH and detoxify the body at the cellular and mitochondrial levels. So if you want to check them out, we'd appreciate that too. That is www.c-60.com. That's c-60.com. Gaius Carbon 60 dietary supplement. So thank them for being a sponsor of the Truth Be Told Radio Network. So what I want to do today, like I said, is I want to try something a little bit different, not a whole lot. And that is, if you've listened to my show before, and if you haven't listened to my show before, what is God Save the King? Well, God Save the King is my ongoing research project into what the nativity really would have looked like. And frankly, that is because the traditional nativity story is a form of Christian mythology. The nativity really didn't look that way. Sure, some of the broad strokes remain the same, but a lot of the details are much different than we have been led to believe over the years, over the decades, and maybe even centuries. And that's actually part of the issue, is that the tradition is actually not as old as we think it is. The notion that the nativity, and especially connecting the nativity to Christmas, quote unquote, is not this long-standing domestic tradition. It's an invented tradition. It was invented to appear as if it is a long-standing domestic tradition, and that actually isn't the case. Okay, so that's not what I want to talk about today, so we're just going to leave that right there. We'll talk about that some other time. But for those of you that have listened to my show before, you're aware of the fact that when this thing all got started, well over 30 years ago, part of the challenge at that time was to try to tell a story that everybody already knew in a new and interesting way. And what that resulted in was realizing that, number one, we really didn't know the story as well as we thought we did. And then once again, like I said, to try to be able to tell it in a new and interesting way. So initially that was accomplished by telling the story through the eyes of different characters in the biblical and historical narrative. In other words, we looked through the eyes of the shepherds, or we looked through the eyes of the Magi, or we looked through the eyes of King Herod and told the story based upon their vantage point. And then over the years, as I continued my research, this morphed into what I call 3 chronicles: the Judean Chronicle, the Roman Chronicle, and the Parthian Chronicle, which is seeing the nativity story through the eyes of the Judeans, right? Then the Romans, and then the Parthians, because they are the major players. Now there's some other players as well. There's some smaller kingdoms, plus some extended context. Especially if you move geographically eastward, there's some extended context, but primarily 3 primary contexts: Judean Chronicle, Roman Chronicle, Parthian Chronicle. So what I want to try to do today is devote like 1/3 of the show to each of those chronicles to tell. And what I want to try to do is to actually connect one larger concept to all 3 chronicles, and we'll see how well I can do that. We'll see if I can pull that off. And I'm not promising I'm going to do this every show. Some shows I will, some shows I won't, where maybe I'll break up the show into 3 segments and we'll talk about new information on each front, right? So that's what I want to do today. Is I do want to talk about some new information that's new to the show, not necessarily new to me, but definitely new to the broadcast, that people may not be aware of. Now, one of the things that you probably are aware of, if you have listened to the show, is that we believe that the date of the death of Herod the Great has been misplaced for quite some time. If you research the subject, you will discover that until the late 19th century, most biblical scholars put the birth of Christ in either 3 or 2 BC, and the death of Herod the Great in either 2 or 1 BC. But then in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a German theologian by the name of Emil Schur wrote this epic work of his, The Jewish People in the Times of Jesus Christ. I'm paraphrasing the title. But he came out and said, no, we've had it wrong all this time. Herod actually died in 4 BC. Well, the short story is that no, Emil Schur had it wrong, right? The problem is that his work had such an enormous impact that for about the next 60 years, everybody believed that Herod died in 4 BC, and therefore we started looking for the birth of Christ only in 4 BC or earlier. And as a result, there are just a ton of really erroneous theories out there that, once again, they place the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC, and therefore they try to place the birth of Christ in 4 BC or earlier. And it's just, they're a mess because they're off. It's just that simple. They are off by 3 years. And as a result of being off by 3 years, when they try to consult what historical records we do have, they don't line up, right? So now this is where you really run into a problem, because this is the challenge with historical research in general, is that historical research in general is always fragmentary in nature. We never have the amount of evidence that we would truly like to have. We have bits and pieces of evidence that we have to put together, as I've said many times, like a jigsaw puzzle. It's just that you're doing the jigsaw puzzle upside down, right? All you can see is the vague shape of the piece of the puzzle. And, oh, well, this one must fit next to this one because they vaguely kind of, look at that, they do fit. And then once you've got enough pieces put together, then you can flip it over and see if there's a picture, right? And see if that picture makes sense. That's the metaphor that I've liked to use over the years with, how historical research works in general and how the nativity in particular works. It's not easy to try to get the picture of what this looks like because the evidence is very, very fragmentary. But as I said, if you place the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC or earlier, and therefore look for the birth of Christ in only 4 BC or earlier, number one, you're missing it. And number two, the historical and other records don't line up. So now you've got this challenge of historical research, which is, do you try to make it fit? And see, and that's, you just can't do that, because you're just going to create all kinds of a mess if you try to make it fit. And that just doesn't work, right? Well, thankfully it actually trickled in for many, many years, but in roughly the mid-1960s is when there was a real flip, okay? And some biblical scholars started to question whether Herod was actually born, or pardon me, Herod actually died in 4 BC or not. And this is, of course, based on the eclipse that is mentioned by Josephus, that very shortly before Herod died, only about 2 weeks before Herod died, there was a lunar eclipse that was visible from Judea. And of the candidate eclipse, because, in today's technological society, culture, scientific environment, we can consult a computer program and say, okay, when were there lunar eclipses visible in Judea, on what dates, right? And so there was a lunar eclipse in 4 BC and a lunar eclipse in 1 BC. There's actually several others as well, but those are the two predominant ones. And that Emil Schur selected the one in 4 BC and said, yeah, no, the one in 1 BC is not right. Well, he had it wrong. The one in 4 BC is the one that's wrong. It's the one that's in 1 BC that is correct. So that lunar eclipse occurred on January 9th or 10th, depending upon how you read the Jewish versus English, for lack of a better word, calendar. What's the word I'm looking for there? Julian, not Julian, Gregorian calendar, right? The Julian calendar, that was Julius Caesar. Gregorian was later, right? So, and that's another challenge, is trying to match up the ancient calendars with the modern calendars, and then the Jewish calendar versus the Roman calendar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and being able to express that in a way that people understand. Okay. Well, the end result is that we believe that Jesus of Nazareth was actually born on September 11th of 3 BC, and that it was about 15 months later is when the Magi arrived, and then Herod expired. Okay. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is additional evidence that points to that 1 BC death of Herod, and also how it influences the story, because there's some components to the story here that most of us have never heard, ever. I've never heard a nativity story talk about some of the stuff that I'm going to mention today. Okay. So what I want to talk about is, I want to talk about a man whose name is Gaius Caesar. Okay. Now, who is Gaius Caesar? Well, Gaius Caesar was the successor to Augustus. Now, he was Augustus' grandson. Augustus did not have any male children. He had daughters, and then his daughter Julia had 2 sons, Gaius and Lucius. And then what Augustus did is he adopted his grandsons as his sons, and then he treated them as sons, and he educated them and raised them and trained them, Gaius in particular, to become his heir. Okay. So this was, vaguely similar to what had happened to him, because, he was not Julius Caesar's son. He was Julius Caesar's grandnephew, either grandnephew or great nephew. I forget which off the top of my head. But then Julius Caesar adopted Octavian, right? And then later in his life, he adopted the title Augustus, right? So this is vaguely similar to that, except that they are his grandchildren, his grandsons. And he selects Gaius, the elder, to be his replacement, right? Because Octavian was born in 63 BC. Now think about this for a second, okay? Because over the past several episodes, we've been talking about the house and lineage of David. And I have shared a lot more of the detailed information from a period of time from about 67 BC until about 40 BC. This is all critical background to really understanding the environment of what was going on at the time. And a good cutoff point is that when Queen Alexandra Salome of Judea died, Queen Alexandra Salome died in 67 BC, her two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, engaged in a civil war over the throne. Hyrcanus was the elder, Aristobulus was the younger. Hyrcanus inherited the throne by right of primogeniture and the fact that his mother had declared that he would be high priest and king, right? But then Aristobulus got a burr under his saddle and he went in and took the throne, right? So now you've got this civil war for the next several years, beginning in roughly 67 BC, okay? Well, 67 BC is also when Pompey Magnus came out of retirement in Rome to deal with the problem of piracy in the Mediterranean, naval maritime raiders going after the supply chain around the Mediterranean. So Pompey dealt with that, and then he moved on and took over command of the Roman armies in the east, where he fought Mithridates in Pontus, in Asia Minor, and then he moved. And as a result of that war, Syria became a Roman province. And then as a result of that, Pompey set his eyes on Judea, right? So ironically, it was in 63 BC is when Pompey arrived in Judea himself to put an end to this nonsense, from his opinion. And Aristobulus had barricaded himself in the temple and his forces, and Pompey, sieged and then, went into the temple and, slaughtered a whole bunch of Jews. And then he went into the sanctuary and maybe even the Holy of Holies. And that would have been in 63 BC. So it was in 63 BC that Judea became a Roman client kingdom moving forward. They were definitely a tributary of Rome beginning in 63 BC. Well, 63 BC is also the year that Octavian was born. Okay? Octavian was born in 63. So now it's really interesting to look at the ages of the players, right? Because this means that Herod was born in 70, 71, 72 BC. We don't know the exact date, right? But that means Herod is roughly 8 to 10 years older than Octavian, right? So by the time you get to the birth of Christ, they're both getting fairly old for that day and time. Not horrifically old, because I think longevity was longer than we thought it was at that time. But that means that, Herod is 70 years old, right? Octavian's 62, 63, right? And it's his grandsons, right? It's his grandsons that are going to take over, Gaius in particular. So Gaius was born in 20 BC. Well, that's going to be roughly the same time as Joseph and Mary being born. So isn't this interesting, right? Not that they knew each other or even knew about each other. Hardly at all. Although we're going to find out something very interesting here in a few minutes with regard to Gaius Caesar, okay? Is that they're about the same age, roughly speaking, right? I personally tend to believe that Joseph and Mary were probably closer to their late teens or early 20s. Again, this is contrary to a lot of traditions. They might have been younger. Mary could have been as young as 14, 15, 16 years old. Joseph could have been as young as 17. That's possible. And I would never, make a huge issue out of someone who said that that's about how old they were. I, however, tend to think they were a little bit older. I think a better guesstimate is more around 19 or 20. Okay. And part of the reason I think this is because of the history of the region. Okay, the region of Galilee, because Galilee was deliberately repopulated by the Hasmoneans about 100 years earlier. They had engaged in a very deliberate migration of Galilee with Judeans from the south. And the point being is that these were devout Jews. They specifically and deliberately wanted to move devout Jews into Galilee to help re-Judaize the area. And what we discover is that for the next 100 years and more, frankly, that Galilee was actually a hotbed of Jewish patriotism. So it's very interesting that we get stories about rebels in Galilee. We talked at least partially about how when Herod was declared governor of Galilee by his father Antipater, okay, one of Herod's first responsibilities was to quell these uprisings and rebellions by these domestic terrorist / rebel robber bandits in Galilee, right? Well, as I've said many times, one man's rebel is another man's patriot. So a lot really depends upon whose point of view you're speaking of as to whether these were rebels or patriots, right? But that was part of Herod's job. But that gives you a little more perspective on the environment in Galilee. Galilee was a hotbed of religious and national patriotism of the Jews that lived there. There were a lot of Judeans living in Galilee due to this deliberate migration. So now if we focus in, like I said, part of what I'm after here is additional information that's going to help establish the fact that Herod died in 1 BC. Okay. And one of the challenges here is that you've actually got a major war that breaks out between Judea and Rome right after Herod's death. Okay. Now, I want to make a side note about this. This is very important because, like I said, number one, how many of us have ever heard, okay, about the fact that there was a major war. Can I say that again? Just in case you didn't hear me. Major war between the Jews and Rome after Herod's death. Who has ever heard that before? Okay. Right now, I'm aware because I've been aware of it for years because of the research. I've just never had the chance to talk about it in one of my lectures before. Okay, a major war, right? And it's mentioned by Josephus. Okay, the records of this war is in Josephus, and then there's Roman records as well. But my point being is you've got a major war that is largely unheard of, right? So my point here again is that history is fragmentary. History is fragmentary because we frequently get the complaint, for lack of a better word, that, oh, well, XYZ couldn't have happened because it would have been such a big deal that somebody would have mentioned it. Well, that's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily true because this is a great example because by placing the death of Herod the Great earlier, this created all kinds of problems because there is record of this war. That's the thing. There are records of this war. Okay. But by placing Herod's death earlier, they were looking in the wrong place. And of course, they couldn't find it. The records didn't line up. They didn't match up because you're looking in the wrong place. Okay. So here's what I want to point to here, because what I want to do is I want to share a little bit from the Roman Chronicle, a little bit from the Parthian Chronicle, and a little bit from the Judean Chronicle and see how they all fit together, right? Okay, so the Roman Chronicle is about this man, Gaius Caesar. Now, Gaius Caesar, once again, is Augustus' grandson, and he, at the time of our story in 1 BC, he's about 18 or 19 years old, and Augustus is grooming him to be the next emperor. And as part of his training, he is going to send Gaius to the east to become the commander of all Roman forces in the east. Okay? He's going to send him to Roman Syria, or frankly, Roman Armenia, to take charge of the Roman legions and just run the East, run the Roman East for the Roman Empire, so that he gets a little bit of experience. And then when, Augustus dies, Gaius can come back and he can become emperor, with some real life experience, right? So he is planning on, he sends him, here you go. He plans on sending him to Armenia, okay, in 1 BC. That's the plan. Augustus is already planning on doing this. Excuse me, I'm going to have to clear my throat here. Sorry about that. So this is Augustus' plan, is he is planning on sending Gaius to Roman Armenia in 1 BC anyway, right? But what happens is Herod dies, right? And that throws a monkey wrench in the works, because several things start to happen at once, okay? Which is that, as we've talked about before, Herod was very fond of eliminating his enemies, right? And he murdered one of his own wives, 2 of his own sons, and then right before he died, he executed a high priest, and he executed a bunch of men that were responsible for tearing down the eagle that had adorned the temple, right? So the Jews pitched a fit and started protesting and frankly rioting because of these executions that Herod had engaged in. That made them very upset. So you got protests, violent protests, riots, and things like that. Okay, there's a lot of tumult right as Herod is about to die. And as I've said before, there's a story, we don't absolutely know for sure that it's true, but because Josephus, we know he was known to embellish from time to time, that Herod, realizing that he's going to die, he wanted there to be sufficient mourning in Judea, and he knew that his death would be celebrated. It wouldn't be mourned, it would be celebrated. So he needed there to be sufficient grieving throughout Judea when he died. So apparently his plan was to gather up a whole bunch of leading Judean citizens and have them executed, so that there would be lament, and weeping and gnashing of teeth and everything in Judea around the time that he died. But it was really going to be over the fact that he had murdered, all these leading citizens, right? Plus, you've got to mix in the whole slaughter of the innocents with this as well, because the Magi had shown up only a few weeks earlier, made their trip to Bethlehem, then didn't go back to Herod as Herod had requested. And then Herod sends his black ops team into Bethlehem, kills, 10, 15, 20 male children in that area, which that would have been a big deal, right? Now, it's not the hundreds or thousands that tradition has taught. It would have been a very small number, because Bethlehem would have been a very small town. But now you can kind of get the picture. There is a lot of tumult going around right around the time that Herod dies, right? I mean, this is there's just all kinds of stuff. The Magi show up, and as I have talked about before, I don't believe this was 3 guys on camels. I believe this was a major ambassadorial entourage with military escort, which is why Matthew chapter 2, verse 3 says that Herod was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. So that means whatever showed up at his court was significant enough and threatening enough that not only Herod, but all Jerusalem panicked. Not only Herod, but all Jerusalem panicked at whatever showed up there, okay? So I believe that means an official ambassadorial entourage with military escort. In other words, a small army. And when you understand Herod's background, the fact that he had dealt with this before, that the Parthians had invaded Judea before and installed a king of their choosing on the throne. See, so that's what this looks like, is it looks like the Parthians are getting ready to do it again, that they are about to invade Judea, and they're going to install a pro-Parthian, anti-Roman king on the throne of Judea, right? And Herod is trying to pass the baton to one of his sons. Now, as I started to mention earlier, Herod, murdered one of his wives, murdered two of his own sons, murdered this high priest, and there's just all kinds of tumult around his death. Well, he's also rewriting his will over and over and over again. He rewrites his will several times, and then that'll be the subject of another episode to look at that in detail. But at this point, by the time you get to this point, it is fairly obvious that his son Archelaus is going to be his primary heir. Now, not his exclusive heir, but his primary heir, and that Herod will divide the kingdom between Archelaus and then Philip, and who's the third? I forget. There's just so many names. It's so difficult at times to remember all of the names because there's just so darn many of them. Trying to remember it all. But Antipas. There you go. Duh. Okay. Can't believe I didn't have that on the tip of my tongue. But at any rate, Herod dies, right? And Archelaus is going to go to Rome. Okay. I'm not sure whether Antipas goes to Rome or not. Archelaus definitely goes to Rome, and he goes to Rome with a copy of his father's will to get Caesar to approve, to get Augustus to put his stamp of approval on his kingship, his client kingship of Judea, right? So when he arrives in Rome to plead his case, Augustus, per usual for Augustus, he did not take sole responsibility for the decision. Okay, Augustus, and that for both good and bad reasons, right? But what he did is he convened a council of senators. He put together this little council and said, okay, let's talk this through and figure it out. What's the best way to do this? Well, included in this council was his grandson, Gaius. He wants Gaius in on this because he's training him to take over, right? So at first, it appears as if they're pretty much going to grant Archelaus claim, right? Kind of appears that way, that's how it's going to go, right? And a big reason for this, a big reason it appears that they are going to go with Archelaus's claim is because, of course, Herod bequeathed a bunch of money, okay, to Augustus. I mean, a lot, okay, like tens of millions of sesterces, right? That's the Roman coin, right? Tens of millions of sesterces, a lot of money is what Herod has bequeathed to Augustus, right? Now, so therefore, you can imagine what Augustus is doing here. Number one, he is going to grant Archelaus's claim, and then number two, he wants to make sure he gets that money, right? So it appears, I don't know the full story here, because I've been checking my sources and trying to make sure that I nail this down. But there's a man named Sabinus, right? Now, he's definitely mentioned by Josephus, so there's no question that this apparently was a real guy. But exactly who he was and exactly what he did is not exactly clear. Exactly. Okay, in case you missed the word exactly there. But Sabinus is an agent of Augustus in some way, shape, or form, and he goes to Judea, frankly, kind of make sure the money gets protected, right? It kind of appears that is his primary goal, is that he's there after Herod's money and to make sure that money gets back to Augustus, right? Okay. And this is the part that's unclear. I don't know the exact nature of this just yet, which is whether Sabinus garrisoned Judea. In other words, did Sabinus move Roman troops into Judea? Now, the fact that he would have brought some troops with him, that's pretty much a given, right? But did he, quote unquote, garrison Roman troops in Judea? That's not entirely clear. But the point being is that, if Herod died in January of 1 BC, right? And now you've got the whole funeral thing for Herod. That's part of the reason we know it has to have been 1 BC, is because Josephus describes all these events that transpired between Herod's death and Passover of the same year, right? And there's about 3 months worth of events, right? January, February, March, April. Okay. There's about 3 months worth, about 90 days worth of events that have to take place between the eclipse and then Herod's death and then Passover, right? For all these things to take place. And if you go back to 4 BC, there's no way all those things can fit into that short period of time, because the amount of time from the eclipse to Passover in 4 BC is like 30 days. So it's nowhere near enough. It's got to be 1 BC, right? And this includes Archelaus going to Rome to make his case, right? And like I said, he makes his case before Augustus. Augustus convenes this council, and Gaius Caesar, his grandson, who he is planning on sending to Roman Armenia anyway, okay, planning on sending to Roman Armenia anyway, is in this council, right? So like I said, and so, but then Augustus sends this guy Sabinus to Judea to secure the money, right? To secure the money is pretty much what it boils down to, okay? Now, meanwhile, so here we go. So that's the Roman Chronicle with a little bit of Judean thrown in, right? The Roman Chronicle with a little bit of Judean Chronicle mixed in. But meanwhile, on the other side of the forest, in the Parthian Chronicle, what's going on at the same time, okay? Well, the Parthians decide to create a problem in Armenia, right? Because Armenia is also a Roman client kingdom at this time. So there is a Roman appointed king in Armenia. And Armenia was kind of this buffer zone. Buffer isn't the exact right word, but it's close enough. Armenia was kind of this buffer between Rome and Parthia, okay? Because what Rome tended to do, I should get a map up here, but I don't want to have one available quickly, otherwise I'd show you. Because what Rome would do is they would pretty much move due east through Asia Minor until they hit a section of the Euphrates River that at that point was pretty much north and south. The Euphrates, for most of its runs on an angle. The headwaters are, of course, up north, and then it runs downstream and exits out the Persian Gulf, okay? So technically it runs from north to south. But if you express it as running from south to north, it would run from the Persian Gulf northwest up to northern Mesopotamia, and then it takes a right turn, and there's a section of the Euphrates that runs pretty much due north and south. And it was in that section there where the Euphrates was north and south that is where Rome would cross the river. That's where they would cross the Euphrates, is in that section there. They didn't do it down further south where the river was at an angle. It was pretty much north and south, and they would cross the river there. And then as a result, they would continue to move essentially due east into Armenia. And they never really got to do this. They wanted to then, what the Romans would want to do is then they'd want to make a right turn and drop down south into Mesopotamia and go after, the Mesopotamian heartland and the heart of the Parthian Empire, meaning, Seleucia, the cities of, Nineveh, and then Seleucia and Ctesiphon, right? Babylon, this kind of thing. They did eventually do that later, but in our time frame, the Romans were never able to make that right turn, right? But the point being is that they would move due east, that Armenia was this really contested area / buffer zone between Rome and Parthia. Okay. And so what Parthia is doing at this same time is they're causing problems in Armenia. So go figure, Augustus is actually planning on sending Gaius to Armenia anyway, and then the Parthians start making problems because they managed to get the Roman appointed king bumped off the throne, right, and temporarily installed their own pro-Parthian king, right? Now, it's highly okay, I won't go into that particular detail. Anyway, but like I said, this is in the context of Herod dies, right? Archelaus goes to Rome to make his case, and then revolt is breaking out in Judea. Augustus sends Sabinus to Judea, okay, to protect the money. He undoubtedly brings at least some troops with him, right? But then the revolt breaks out, which means Archelaus's army has to try to deal with the revolt. And frankly, the bottom line here is they can't really. They're not adequate to the task. Okay. So therefore, in order to deal with the problem, Augustus, through his commander in the east, whose name is Varus, right? Who is, I forget whether he was officially the governor of Roman Syria at this time, but he was definitely a high-ranking official in Roman Syria at the time. Might have actually been the governor, okay? Augustus tells Varus to deal with it, right? And so Varus has either 3 or 4 Roman legions at his disposal. 3 to 4 legions at his disposal, right? That here's the key, he moves into Judea to deal with the Judean revolt. Okay, now this is a big deal because this is the war I mentioned earlier in the show. This is the war I mentioned earlier in the show. Okay, and this is taking place in the summer and fall of 1 BC. You've got a major war between the Jews and the Romans going on in Galilee and Judea and Idumea. Major battles, okay? And part of the reason we know this is because that Varus has to take the Syrian legions into Judea, so the Syrian legions aren't available. They are not available for Gaius Caesar to take them to Armenia, right? So this is part of how we know that that the time frame is correct. Okay, this is part of how we know that the time frame is correct, because what happens is that Gaius Caesar is supposed to go straight to Armenia. He doesn't. He actually sails to Egypt first and then moves from Egypt through the Sinai Peninsula up through the southern region of Judea, which is Idumea, Nabatea and Idumea, and he engages the Jews there. Right? So he is the commander of the southern forces fighting in Idumea against the Jewish rebels, quote unquote, Jewish rebels. Rebels against Rome for sure, right? Rebels against the Herodian dynasty and therefore Rome, right? So Gaius Caesar actually spends a significant amount of time in Idumea and Judea in the summer and fall of 1 BC before he makes it up to Armenia, because that's where the Syrian legions are because of this rebellion. And, those legions are not available to move into Armenia. So, excuse me, I got to clear my throat again. So, pretty interesting stuff here, because once again, this helps really establish, okay, the time frame. It's pretty darn clear what the time frame is now, right? Because you've got the eclipse, right? You've got the fact that you've got the let's talk about some major points here, right? I absolutely believe that the sign signified by the Magi, right? When the Magi said, "We have seen his star in the east," that is a reference to an heliacal rising of the star Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus in Leo on July 29th of 3 BC. Okay, that is the sign that clued off the Magi. Now, that resulted in them observing an unprecedented series of events for about the next 15 months. Okay, but it was kicked off by the heliacal rising of Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus in Leo on July 29th of 3 BC, right? Then and I won't go through all of the celestial signs, but then we are given the celestial sign in Revelation chapter 1 of the woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, that I believe occurred on the evening of September 11th in 3 BC, which corresponds to Tishri 1, Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, and that therefore Jesus was born on the Jewish civil New Year. Now, some people place it a year later. I think that's too late, because I don't believe the heliacal rising of Jupiter in 2 BC has the same significance as the heliacal rising of Jupiter in 3 BC, because the heliacal rising of Jupiter in 3 BC was the sun and Jupiter were in the same sign, whereas in the following year the sun was in Jupiter was in the sun was in Leo, but Jupiter was in Virgo, or the other way around. I forget which, but that's the heliacal rising in 2 BC. The sun and Jupiter were not in the same sign. Okay, and according to Mesopotamian omens, that is not significant. As a matter of fact, when that occurs, you don't pay attention, you ignore the omen. But when Jupiter and the sun are in the same sign, that's when you pay attention, right? So that's what got the Magi's attention. So like I said, unprecedented series of events for the next 15 months, right? So you fast forward all the way to December of 2 BC, right? Which is when the Magi arrive in Judea, right? They go to the court of Herod the Great. Herod sends them to Bethlehem, points them in the direction of Bethlehem. And then it says that when they were moving en route from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, it says the star came and stood over the town, right? Well, that is a thing called the stations of Jupiter, right? And Mesopotamian Magi were obsessed with the star Jupiter. They tracked its location every single day. Every single day. So during their daily observation of Jupiter, they would have gone out in the evening and noticed that, oh my God, this is the stations of Jupiter. The stations of Jupiter refers to the retrograde motion of Jupiter, the annual retrograde motion of Jupiter. And there would be certain days when it would appear that Jupiter would stand still. Okay. We'll talk about that in detail on another segment, but that occurred. Okay. And I don't have the exact date in front of me. I believe it's December 28th or 29th of 2 BC. So that's a verifiable date. It's a verifiable date. All you need is a computer astronomy program, and there it is, right? Okay. And those are signs that fit extraordinarily precisely with what the Mesopotamian / Parthian Magi would have found significant. Okay, what they would have found significant. All right. So, and then and that's late December 2 BC. Well, a couple of weeks later, you got this lunar eclipse, right? Bingo. I mean, there it is. And then you've got Herod dies. You've got the 3-month period of time between Herod's death and Passover. Archelaus goes to Rome. Augustus is already planning on sending Gaius to Armenia anyway, but then rebellion breaks out. Varus takes the Syrian legions down into Judea, so they're not available to go with Gaius to Armenia. So Gaius sails to Egypt and then comes up through the south and fights the Judean rebels that way, right? So now let's tie it to and then you got Parthia raising a fuss up in Armenia. So the Romans need the legions up in Armenia because the Parthians are creating trouble up there, right? Well, here's a couple other little bits of trivia, and they're not trivia. They're really interesting pieces of the puzzle that fit together here. Well, what about Joseph and Mary? Because the Magi show up, and then that's when Joseph gets spoken to in a dream and told to get out of Bethlehem, right? And they go to Egypt. Well, this would have been in the middle of the winter to early spring of 1 BC is when he's leaving, right? So they leave and they go to Egypt, right? Now, I think, just kind of processing off the top of my head here, I think they got out of Dodge quickly enough that they avoided a lot of the rebellion and therefore avoided much of the war, right? Because there you have it. You've got this. You got all kinds of trouble going on, and they've actually managed to get out of town already, and they're already in Egypt. So the funny thing is as they are traveling to Egypt, I think it's actually a little while later. I think it actually is several months later before Gaius Caesar lands in Egypt and then goes up through the Sinai Peninsula into southern Israel in the region that we would know as Idumea, right? So this makes it interesting because I used to think that Joseph and Mary didn't stay in Egypt all that long. I still think that they didn't stay in Egypt all that long, right? They stayed until they knew that Herod was dead, okay? So that wouldn't have taken very long. I mean, that could have been as short as a few weeks, theoretically. Right now, I think that's not exactly what happened. I think it was at least a few months, and it's possible it may have been a year or more, because it is possible that they became aware, right? That they became aware of the war between the Jews and Rome in Judea, and that they didn't go back right away. Right? So that very easily could have delayed them until maybe the following summer, right? So what would have been the summer of 1 CE or AD, right? Before they went back to Judea. And then when they learned that Archelaus had been confirmed and ruled in Herod's place, because it's very clear they planned on going back to Bethlehem and Judea, right? Remembering that they relocated to Bethlehem. They didn't go to Bethlehem just for the registration. That's been a misunderstanding for a long time. They relocated to Bethlehem, and they never left. They did not go to there wasn't this trip back to Nazareth and then back to Bethlehem. They went to Bethlehem one time, and they never left, right? And then 15 months later, though, they left Bethlehem to go to Egypt, and then they came back intending to go back to Bethlehem. But then when they discovered that Archelaus was there, that's when they had to go back to Nazareth. Now, here's what's really interesting. 30 years later, when Jesus talks about, a city on a hill, right? The city on a hill that he is using as a mind picture is the Roman capital of Galilee called Sepphoris, right? Now, because Sepphoris is about 4 miles northwest of Nazareth in Galilee, and it literally is a city on a hill, okay? And it was there in the late 2nd century BC, but then during this war, it was destroyed. During this war, it was destroyed, and then it would have been rebuilt all through Jesus's childhood when he was being raised by his father Joseph as Habona, a builder, not a carpenter, a builder. And there would have been an abundance of work in Sepphoris for Joseph and then Jesus himself to work in Sepphoris, the Roman city of Sepphoris, which is the city on a hill that he was referring to, right? But it's really interesting that city was destroyed in this war. Okay, because Sepphoris was a hotbed, because it was a Roman city, it was a hotbed of rebellion against the Romans. And then I'm running out of time, but I want to get this in there, which is that when Augustus was planning on sending Gaius to Armenia, he was commissioned a geographer to do some studies for Gaius, so that Gaius would know what he was getting into there. So he commissioned, ready for this, a Greco-Roman, a Greek-speaking Roman who actually happened to be a Parthian citizen to survey the caravan routes in Parthia, right? And this is a guy named Isidore of Charax, right? Isidore, Isidore, right, of Charax, Charax, Isidore of Charax. And then so what he did is he did a survey of the Parthian trade routes, primarily between Armenia and the Persian Gulf, right? Now, he did more, because then he also did the trade routes that would have turned and gone east, ready, to Central Asia, and then all the way to China. In other words, this was the early part of the Silk Road. Okay, and this was Isidore of Charax. It's called the Parthian stations, and this was commissioned by Augustus in order to educate his grandson, who was preparing to go to Armenia in 1 BC. But we get some really great information from the Parthian stations about the caravan routes and what was going on in Parthia at that time, because it's written by a Parthian citizen. So I've run out of time. I really want to thank you for listening today. My name is Tim Keyes. You've been listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. God save the King.